Chapter 7. Night was beginning to fall on Armorica with a dying light akin to the very day's dawn. At first, she had been eager, with her mind awash with fantasies of what Saltmarsh would be like. It was a village, but was it one like Harpestein, a motley gaggle of thatch and board stone huts, or a flourishing walled port with watchtowers, fleets of keelboats anchored by a bustling quayside? The latter Fiona had discarded, for Armorica had a dismal reputation for being wretchedly poor when it came to civilization. Which begged the question whether why anyone would live or stay here. At least on the mainland, there was security and some semblance of order, even with the rebellion raging on. Speaking of, what if Saltmarsh was a rebel hideout? What if the Harpestein sailors, Fingal, and the soldiers were captives, or dead? The dark idea was shaken from Fiona's mind, and she concentrated on her surroundings. The winds had stagnated to the point that the forest was eerily quiet. Her steps upon bramble and twig sounded like thunder breaking the silence. She could focus upon her own breathing, her heartbeat, but to her right she could hear a new sound. Waves? Waves! The mere idea of it was enough to elate her mood and walk on with renewed vigor. After a few minutes of traversing the treacherously uneven terrain, she finally saw the trees part to give way to an eternal grey expanse of sea and fog-ridden skies, ever darkening as night crept on. The cold air kissed her with an icy embrace, and she felt a smile creep upon her face. She felt free. She laughed aloud, a sound of hope and relief intertwined with tears, like a prisoner feeling the air of freedom after languishing in a deep, dark dungeon. She knelt before the coast as the tide gently caressed her ankles before wafting back. She preyed upon that coast, feeling the moment of freedom, soaking it all in before standing up and remembering her initial plan back when she first arrived to this forlorn island. Follow the coast northward. Looking about, as dim as it was, she eventually discovered the remnants of an old footpath, a thin lane of dirt bordered by malignantly growing wild vegetation. Despite the creeping crawl of night looming upon the land, Fiona felt no fear or trepidation, and daintily began what she hoped to be her last march to safety. Something was terribly wrong with Saltmarsh. Just minutes prior to seeing the first signs of human habitation, she had seen peculiarly arranged sticks hanging from strings tied to the branches of coastal trees above the small footpath she trod. The sticks were arranged in odd geometric formations that Fiona knew not to which religion or superstition it belonged to. The recent surge of paganism in her homeland had seen such effigies appear, called wiccas, but she had never paid any heed to such silly superstition. More to that, as she reached the village, she was unnerved by the silence of the settlement and the emptiness of the small roads and footpaths that gradually converged towards the small gaggle of shoddy stone and thatch houses by a ramshackle harbour, empty and dead. Even the coastal waves were quieter here, as though they were timid from the village. The quiet fear crept so hard on her that her hair stood on end, her eyes watered briefly. She looked over her shoulder at the forest and found herself surprised at how dark it was, the suffocating trees tightly battling each other, causing not much beyond a few feet to be swallowed by an abyssal darkness. Had I been travelling through there for so long? She thought incredulously. She was either very mad or very brave. Probably both, she suspected. It was as though she were looking at the forest for the first time. She aptly turned her head away and spurred herself onward, spooked by the threatening presence it silently bared. She stepped towards the village properly and looked around cautiously, gripping the dagger by her belt with reassurance. The village itself was underwhelming. Little more than a dozen huts parted by unkempt coastal vegetation and roads of mud before the ramshackle harbour where sat a gaggle of fishing boats, keelboats, and, what caught Fiona's attention, a sailing ship. The same ship that Fingal, the sailors, and the soldiers had sallied upon. It too floated by the edge of the harbour, its anchor firmly holding in its place. Except for the sound of the sea, the village was quiet. So quiet. Returning to the village, she went on her next quest for finding food, for hunger assailed her. By the harbour there were unopened barrels of fish encased with salt and brine, as well as a basket of eggs from which Fiona broke raw and slurped greedily from. Honeycomb from the mainland and vegetables were scoffed, until Fiona, not used to eating so much so quickly in such a short time, suddenly threw up, causing her to store extra food in her backpack instead of her stomach. As her belly stopped groaning and her mind awoke, she began to become more aware of the village itself. Until now, she had not noticed that all the doors of the village were unlocked, and that they all bore the same symbol painted upon them. A swirling circle. The same circle that the undead man had carved upon his chest. Remembering that terrible moment felt unreal, like a memory concocted by the words of a dark bard's tale, not her own. The sight of these symbols gave her pause, reminding her that she was still in Armorica. She was still unsafe. The village's homes had been abandoned. The streets, however, had not. Across the mud were hooves and paws and claws, bigger than the animals they belonged to. There were human steps, barefoot, recent. She was dismayed by the lack of Greenwichian symbolism anywhere in the village, not even a charm or an amulet. The only form of reverence they had was this swirling circle painted on the doors. Fingal had always said the people of Armorica were strange. Over time, she discovered that the footsteps were not the random meandering wanders of scavengers, but an organized movement. They converged to the far end of the village by a bank of rocks and earth where above the forest into the rest of Armorica began. A set of strange structures stood erect before the bank. Long, large shards of stone from which strange writing and obscene murals had been etched, and around their base lay rotten food and bones. Above each stone was the swirling circle. What paled before her was what made her stagger back, for at the center was a sacrificial bonfire built not by wood, but the bones of humans and beasts, upon which a sapling had been burned along with the charred, shattered remains of something that had been humanoid. Its bone structure was alien, its form large. Chains had been used to restrain it, as it had presumably died in agony from the fires, judging by its contorted skull. And across this ritual site was a human-sized statue of wood, hewn in the form of an egg, but with murals etched across it, and carved outwardly facing Fiona was a screaming face from which tears of dark trickled from its eyes and mouth. A sudden rustling of leaves broke through the spellbinding silence, sharp, close, and followed by the rising patter of approaching footsteps. The sound tore Fiona from the frozen terror that had held her to look upon the alien image she could neither explain nor believe. The movement grew louder. Then, unexpectedly, it was joined by singing. A lilting melody, bright and untroubled, drifting through the chilly night air. It was a cheerful ditty, sung in a high-pitched chorus that could only have belonged to children, or perhaps very young women. The sound floated from somewhere to her far left within the forest, carried by the wind. The innocent song seemed almost absurd against the backdrop of that profaned ritual site. She drew back from the ritual clearing, her movements quick and silent, slipping through the wild roads until she found a nearby cottage. Its door hung half open, unlatched. She slipped inside, thankful to the 12 for the ease of her sharp escape. The singing grew louder, closer, and Fiona's curiosity compelled her toward a narrow window on the opposite wall of the cottage, whereby a shuttered window was. She pressed her face to the shutter and eased it open enough just to see. What emerged from the tree line was both eerie and mesmerizing. The figures were small, perhaps a head taller than gnomes, yet lithe and graceful. Unlike the squat, grim dwergar she'd encountered, these creatures possessed sharp, slender beauty. Graceful faces, small noses, delicate chins, ears tapering to elegant points. Their skin was a mottled mix of dark grey and sickly khaki. Their eyes glimmered black, each with a slitted yellow pupil that caught the cloud-hidden moonlight. They were entirely hairless, their limbs lean and sinewy, hands ending in long, claw-like fingers. Fiona recognized them at once, though she had only ever seen their corpses before. Elves.
"Hello,"
came a voice behind her. It was feminine, or nearly so. A guttural rasping through cracked lips and a smile of long, jagged teeth that grinned with no mirth. Fiona spun, her stomach lurching. An elf stood barely a few feet away in the dark of the cottage. It had been here inside well before Fiona came here. Its androgynous features made it impossible to tell its sex. Its swampy, glistening skin sheened like oil in the gloom. It wore a man's tunic, too large for it, tattered and stiff with dried blood. Around its waist dangled something that made Fiona's breath catch. A rotting human's head. Its eyes were gone, the skin carved with shallow, deliberate dagger marks, symbols Fiona did not understand. Her mouth went dry, and she stared at the abject agony still left on the decapitated man's face. The elf smiled wide and delighted, and stroked the head with a lover's tenderness.
"You like?"
It crooned, voice distorting into a mockery of affection. Before she had a moment to react with her dagger, they were everywhere at once, clawed hands seizing her arms, her shoulders, her legs. The elves swarmed her like carrion birds. She was dragged out into the open while they jabbered and jeered, grinning to her and each other with cruel glee. Boots torn from her feet, their voices were strange, a language of twisted, malformed beauty. Words sung with a cadence of poetry yet broken by croaks and guttural trills, as though corruption had tainted even their speech. At the ritual site, they drew her down, forcefully spreading her limbs across the dirt. They laughed and danced around her with elated fervor, eyes alight with wicked glee. One of them, tall for its kind, adorned with woven reeds and bones, crouched astride her and tugged at her tunic, tearing the fabric without care. Fiona thrashed and screamed, but their strength was unnatural. For all their frail appearance, their grip was iron. Then the leader froze. Its black-eyed gaze fell upon the small, gleaming pendant that hung against Fiona's chest. Then all their malignantly yellow pupils widened with amazement. The Grunician amulet. A murmur rippled through the gathered elves. Their eyes widened, their mirth died. One hissed, another shrieked something that might have been a curse. Within moments, the chorus of their croaking voices rose into a discordant uproar of disgust and alarm. Fiona felt their grasp falter. Seizing the instant, she summoned what power she could, a bolt of energy that surged through her body and burst outward. For a heartbeat, she was free. But the elves were faster. Their shock turned to fury. The leader barked an order. Another elf, this one wielding half a broken oar like a club, stepped forward and swung. The blow caught her on the temple. The world shuddered, spun, then folded into darkness. Dark, dark, dark as his waking thought and dreams of an endless forest of flesh to devour, torture, and despoil. Home was so dark, and reeking with pulsing meat he could never rend or devour. They were like him, and as loath as he was to let them keep beating, he knew Master would not approve. He lumbered around a den of filth and bone among his herd. None were as strong as he, well, save one, but that one was not as smart. The cavern offered no illumination, no release from his roiling lust to hunt, destroy, and feed. Surely Master would let him out again soon. Could Master not feel his frustration, the frustration of the pack? With cloven feet he meandered through the den, where a score of others like him dwelt. Hunched, animal-headed humans like he. All of us are restless, he thought. For all that filled his mind was murder and chaos. They wanted to roam free again, to hunt, to hurt, to eat and sleep before doing it all again and again, until Master would call them back. From the shadows of a nest of rotting flesh, a cat-headed one stared at him. He knew that look. He'd seen it before in his own reflection once, upon the surface of a stream. Simmering violence. He wasn't surprised. That one is weak, he thought. I take his food, his rest. I take his mates for my own. It pleases me and it pleases Master. Now he sees me frustrated and he thinks me distracted. Weak. Their eyes locked. The cat thing lunged, unable to restrain its hunger for violence. It had been a long time coming, and he was grateful that the cat man chose this moment of discontent to strike. Foolish runt, he thought. He was twice its size, stronger by far, but the cat thing was fast, small, black-furred, and battle-scarred from many hunts through Master's forest. The others watched suddenly with gleeful attention. He, however, was in no mood for games in this cramped, stinking den, least of all with such pitiful competition. The cat thing leapt. He anticipated it. He'd seen that move from him many times before. He kicked with his hoof mid-air. A sharp crack filled the den, and he almost groaned with pleasure at the hoarse hiss of pain that escaped his foe. The herd jeered, but he had no desire for glory. Only rage, only hunger, and now bloodshed. The Catman writhed on the ground, nursing his shattered ribs. Disgust curled his lips. He stalked closer as it crawled away, dragging itself across the rock. Where do you think you're going? He squatted over the wounded creature, one massive hand pressing down on its back, the other gripping its neck. The Catman gurgled in shock as he pulled, slowly, deliberately, pleasingly slow. The creature squirmed, claws raking the dirt as the herd circled close, growling and licking their snouts in anticipation. Even the Catman's former mates, those that were left, and those he had taken for his own, hissed and shrieked with cruel delight. It was not a quick death. He tore the head loose in fits and starts, savoring the agony until slivers of boredom overtook him. Then, with one final wrench, he ripped it free and raised it high. The herd roared with glee and fell upon the twitching body, snapping limbs, slurping blood, tearing flesh as though they'd been starved for an age. Master would not be displeased with this kill in his sacred darkness. Master saw all. Master knew all. Master would not punish him. He hoped. He left with his prize, the severed, torn feline head, its face frozen in agony. It still twitched as blood dripped down his arm. It still remarkably ebbed with fading life. A dark idea crept in his mind. He placed it beneath his crotch, before bending slightly and wiping his buttocks with the twitching head, laughing with loud, cruel bellows until it stopped twitching. Then hatred surged through him to crescendo into a chorus of pleasure. With a satisfied snarl, he stomped on it again and again, until it was pulp. One of his mates, a skinny, rat-headed thing, sniffed and licked at the remains on the floor, greedy and unashamed. He lifted his hoof above its uncaring head. He really wanted to stomp on her head. His blood was up and he craved bloodshed. But he couldn't. If Master found out... He lifted his hoof away from the snivelling mate who slurped and licked the mushy remains of the head, and he let out an irritated snort. His blood was up, his hunger roused. He needed more. Then, shouting from above and beyond, from the forest, his ears twitched. Perhaps Master had heard his cravings. Pushing and punching through the herd, he lumbered to the top of the slope where the rest of Master's minions dwelt. He was sure he'd known their names once. Now they were only meat for Master. Meat he was forbidden to touch. Oh, it ached to look at them. Just sacks of flesh to eat, blood to drink. Oh, when would he be allowed to hunt again? He snorted through his snout, the sound echoing in irritation. Other things not like him, lurked in the shadows, its crevices dangling cages or open nests. The hall was vast and lightless, filled with Master's creations. Small, pointy-eared creatures who made their food scream long and loud before savouring it. Short, hairy ones who dragged prey from above for all to play with. Headless things with faces in their chest, babbling endlessly. Man-headed horses, winged women, scaled birds. All of them agents of chaos in Master's name. Master made them. Master led them. Master fed them. The last part was all he cared about. He was so hungry, always. Even his dreams mocked him, dreams of running through the world above, chasing litters of screaming prey without breaking a sweat, only to wake gnawing his own arm. Sometimes, rarely, he dreamed of something else, something deep within him laughing at him, cruel and mocking, and he was doing something, somewhere strange and alien, a world of... The noise shattered his thoughts. The small, pointy-eared things scurried into the hall, gibbering and dancing excitedly. Between them, dragged like trophies, came two larger figures. Humans. One was a man, his clothes so torn he was nearly naked, his skin raw with cuts and welts. He wept as they poked him with crude spears, occasionally whipping his bare flesh to make him stumble and dance. The other, he realized, was a woman. Carried limply, but almost with reverence. The little creatures handled her with uncharacteristic care. He found it strange. They feared only Master. The elves brought their captives to the only lit place in the hall, the entrance to Master's chamber. Neither he nor any of the herd were permitted near it. He knew why. Master had made them, molded them, and he hated them. They were born simply to hunt and obey him. The two humans were dragged into the glowing chamber. The herd growled in frustration. He flinched, as did all when the scream came. It was a familiar sound, a scream of joy from Master. Master emerged, and the little creatures rushed in to haul the two back out. The man still lived, struggling weakly. Master spoke without words, his decrees pressed directly into their minds. The man was thrown to the floor before the salivating mob of minions. Food, came the vision, sloughing flesh, marrow sucked from bone, blood spraying from torn arteries. The herd around him salivated, aroused and frenzied at the promise of fresh meat after chewing only bones and scraps for so long. Then the woman. She was placed on a stone altar, and the vision came excitedly from Master. The word came, boon. She would become one of them. All who bore the mark of Master's enemy were boons. With the visionary word, he, like all who belonged to Master, knew that boons were Master's greatest delight. The corruption of the interfering gods who now lay claim to the world that was once theirs. Such boons like this woman thing would be a gleeful insult to the new god's face, as Master remakes them into a shape of his choosing. A beast thing like him. Her skin carved with Master's mark before she would be sunk into the black ichor from which all beasts were born. He did not know how Master chose. None did. Master was omniscient, glorious, wise and terrible. He knew his place before the Master, and soon this woman thing would too. The herd, elated at the coming of another potential hunter, growled and jeered at the still woman. He did not. Why? Something rose in his throat, a bile. Not just that. Since he'd first seen her, something stirred in him that he hadn't felt since... Since when? It wasn't lust, not exactly, though his heart quickened. It wasn't just his heart. His mind burned. The clothes, her hair, the silver clasp that bound her cloak, it all struck something within him. Master began the ritual, commanding his servants to bring the tools. The carving dagger, the plants he burned with a flick of his fingers, and the basin of blackness from which all beasts were born. The Master leaned close to the woman's face. His fists curled. He blinked, as though struck by thought. Then he saw that she began to stir. Dreaming, he could see it. The same nightmare all of them had before, awakening in the dark that greeted them after sleep. A dream of endless depths, of existence unmade. A poison. A poison? He suddenly thought to himself. Where did such an idea come from? No. Something was happening to him. An uncertainty. A divergence from his primal directions decreed by his master. And with that uncertainty came... feelings. No. Memories. When the elves returned with the tools, the pleased master gestured for them to begin. The elfings were elated with lascivious joy. One of the elves, drab and dirty human clothes too big for it, undressed eagerly, leapt upon the altar and knelt over the woman, its face mad with simmering heat. The other two elves lifted the remnants of her skirt up to expose her nakedness, as the elf on the altar, with Master's blessing, began to rub himself erect. The final act before corruption. Like all beast things that he'd seen Master make, the last part of the old self would be stripped away with a ritual of fornication. But not him, he thought. He was always what he was. He was... wasn't he? A self-reflection seeped through his thoughts like an invasive cancer, and with those thoughts came memories. Of light, of free will, of something else. Too scared to interrupt Master in his moment of the ritual, he instead left the battle in his brain go on. The herd around him roared in excitement, the minions danced with cruel delight, the elves, sordid and trembling, touched her with vile curiosity while she stirred in her drugged stupor from Master's whispering. Other creatures, small and large, came to light the plants that Master had requested. He knew not why all this was needed. Indeed, he cared not, for the sight of the woman, and more to it, the sight of her impending defilement, was a captivated door to a world he never knew existed in all his eternity, in this dark, dank, bloody pit of lust and hate. At this point, the herd had tore into the screaming man whom Master had decreed as food. His legs gone, then his arms, then his belly. The hall echoed with the music of feeding and madness. But all that, in this moment, ceased to matter. Looking upon her now, something within him snapped. He roared a sound that shook the cavern, but was deafened by the cacophony of other creatures around the large hall. His saliva flying, voice cracking to silence. With a strength born from something deeper than rage, something that pierced the fog of Master's control, he charged. Through an eternity of blissful darkness did Fiona slumber. Never did the question of whether she was alive or dead pass her consciousness, only that she was in a state of continual harmony. She only registered this, however, when a certain lucidity to her status suddenly grew. From the nothingness of nothing came forth a familiar place. A black, starless sky above an endless dark ocean which reflected the light of a sun that was not there. And the terrifying presence beneath the sable veil above. She felt it. Someone? Something? It or they watched her, and suddenly she felt naked and ashamed before its invisible gaze that seemed to scry her very existence. She was further haunted by the first question that came to her. Is this God? Is this the gate to the next world? With courage that did not come easy, Fiona looked up. It felt as though she warred against an army, pulling her gaze back down to the ocean, and she could feel the weight of her exertion. But she did. She looked up and faced the veil, faced God. She heard a voice. It did not echo amid the abyssal expanse. It was loud, and yet soft and gentle, and ancient. It did not speak with words, but with memories and thoughts. Swirling sounds like an ocean assailed her existence, and she felt a pouring wind rush past her. She gazed upon the eyes of another, of whom she knew not, but she gazed willingly at a brightness like a newborn seeing the world. A vast, vast blue sky, not of her home. This sky was a pale shade of endless, cloudless blue. No land, just an ocean with no ripple or wave. And to the distance, standing upon the water, was a man, silhouetted by the distance. No, not a man, Fiona realized. The performance of a man. It was a colossus, a living effigy that stood erect upon the water. It looked at something above with hatred. Fiona looked up and found her vision instantly snap back to the focus of this colossal man. An action she made born of instant, crippling fear. Something terrifying was above her. Something that made a cacophony of strange noises and indecipherable gargling too alien for her own existence to dare to look at. The colossal naked giant, whose form was shadowed, and whose strange head touched the very sky, looked away from above her to whatever malignant presence bound Fiona and turned two red slits for eyes on her. The divinity of the alien thing was apparent, and she felt her soul wither from its gaze, before a noise from all around her assailed her feelings and pushed her into the water of this strange world, drowning in it as the sound of laughter and garbled voices ruptured all thoughts for calm. Down, down, down she plunged, forced into the depths of a warm ocean before the gradual pool of death came to carry her back into the eternal void of nothing. From dreams of herself submerged in the cosmic depths of a dark alien ocean, did she suddenly awake to find herself in the very same condition? Fiona was drowning, she was sure of it, but she was splashing, and she struggled to breathe now and then. And by the 12, she was freezingly cold. Her clothes were torn to shreds, but still worn. She looked around at a dawn daylight, cloaked by dark, almost black clouds, heavy rain and a storm of thunder across the sea. The tides were up and splashing roughly. There were things around her, wood, houses, boats, salt marsh. Salt marsh! She was flailing in the churning coastal waters. Grasping the edge of the boardwalk, she hauled herself out of the sea. Ahead lay a cluster of boats, some with oars, others with sails. Just then she heard heavy movement behind her, somewhere in the village. Still groggy from her vivid dreams, she turned, terrified of what she might see. Forsooth, she screamed, a wailing cry of one who knows they are about to die, clutching at her exposed legs in shame, for fear she may wet herself. 10 feet away stood a giant, hooved creature, part beast, part man. Its head and lower body were like that of a boar, eyes burning crimson with rage. Scars laced its flesh where patches of fur had been torn away. The rest of it was humanoid, yet twisted, massive, hunched and spattered with filth and blood. The boar man crouched on all fours, knuckles pressed to the earth as though it was ready to charge. Fiona shut her eyes. It was too late. The elves would have killed her, but they weren't here anymore. They must have fallen to this abomination while trying to flee. It didn't matter, elves or monster. She was dead. Just let him kill me, she thought. I'd go to God anyway. But the creature didn't pounce. Instead, it lumbered toward her with surprising speed. Fiona whimpered, eyes squeezed shut, and the stench of blood and sweat filled her senses. It gurgled. It roared, and she opened her eyes in fright at the sound of its voice. Fona? Fiona couldn't believe this aberration could speak, let alone say, Fiona! It bellowed again, its snout inches from her face. It meekly pointed with a giant finger at the brooch that held her tattered cloak together. The brooch that... She froze. The creature bowed its head, stifling growls as saliva dripped from its tusked jaws.
Fingal?
Fiona shakily whispered. She could hardly believe the name left her lips. The creature groaned, a sound that was deep beneath the bestial noise, unmistakably human and pained.
Fingal?
She said again, louder. Fona! He pointed with his massive claws towards the empty boats that were tied along the bay behind her. She felt feverish, like none of this was happening. Despite his hulking, apish appearance, the sadness and somewhat familiarity of his once human gentleness swayed Fiona into a fool's hope.
Fingal! Come with me, my love. Come with me. I came to find you. Let's go.
In a surge of reckless, if not ludicrously foolish courage, she placed her palms on either side of his snout. He growled, the sound pained and trembling.
We'll find a cleric, or a healer, or a druid, anyone. Just come with me, Fingal. I came here to save you. Please, please.
Her last words were but soft pleading whispers through wet, teary lips. The growling softened to a guttural thrum. He nudged his head against her, an awkward, clumsy bump, but gentle. In his malformed state, he had tried to kiss her in turn. Fiona kissed his snout and lips, and for a moment his trembling form grew still, his monstrous strength melting to a relaxed state beneath her human touch.
No heal, Fiona. Monster downed.
He pointed to himself with an anguished look.
Monster.
Fiona's face crumpled as she broke into sobs. Fingal, on his knees, bowed his head in shame. He answered through a drooling growl, the words lost in the struggle to remain human.
Go.
Fiona didn't move. He bellowed, muscles bulging as the rage began to return.
Go now.
He shoved her away.
Go.
He roared again, his voice cracking, thrashing about the bay on the spot as the beast took hold once more. Rage consumed him. The man was gone. The monster had returned. The land had grown heavily foggy, as well as stormy, obscuring much of her surroundings into hazy blurs. A rising noise came from the forest beyond Saltmarsh, the sound of monstrous, furious cries. Fiona realized then, Fingal had saved her from the elves. Speeding with tears of anguish and terror, obeying her husband's plea, she practically flew into the furthest rowboat she could find, looking to see if Fingal was there. But alas, the boar man was now bloodthirsty, and roaring hatefully at her, throwing barrels at her with clumsy precision. A horrific croaking scream shook the village and nearly made her freeze, had it not been for the rush of her blood, screaming for her to just keep going. The horrific screaming came again, thankfully slightly more distant, as Fiona rode speedily from the village, and the voices of things grew into a chorus of angry, aching growls. Fingal spun around at the noise, hopping to and fro as though he itched all over, roaring and wailing with bestial rage, frothing from his tusked mouth. He was facing the sound of the oncoming beast's nightmares. Fiona was now 30 or so feet from the village when she saw it suddenly populate with things she did not know how to describe, other than that they were amalgamations between beasts and man. Dog-headed, horse-headed, rat-headed. They were grotesquely malformed mockeries of man, just as Fingal was. Other things, small things with spidery speed, sprinted to the edge of the harbour. Elves, kobolds, goblins, centaurs, blemmy, black dogs and trow. More shapes still that were half concealed by the fog. Fiona screamed her husband's name as he went on all fours and pounced upon the first line of the monster mob like a siege engine upon a portcullis. A sudden torrent of screams and roars broke from their angry shouts as Fingal, a considerably large and tough beast man, compared to the most of them, savaged the elves, gored the goblins, gores and slams, stomping on them with his hooves or crushing them with his tusks and fists. Fiona rode on with quick breaths as she saw her love, even in his broken, cursed state, fight for her escape. He was a whirlwind of raw violence made manifest. Before the fog began to cloak the gory battle by the bays of Saltmarsh, Fiona witnessed what might have been Fingal's match. Another beast man, twice his size, and with the head of a moose. She saw it break a part of the anchored sailing ship by the bay, and batter Fingal repeatedly over the head. Fingal had ignored them at first, but after the 6th or 7th, he knelt, and the creatures of Armorica fell upon him with bites, stabs, and bludgeons. He was surrounded, lost to their violent reverie, before a mass of them seemed to ignore Fingal and speed along the boardwalks over to the sea. All of them looked at Fiona. The eyes, they wanted to kill her, as they all made obscene gestures of sadistic cruelty, snapping timbers to pieces, stomping apishly along the harbour, or screamed with visceral anger at her, urging her to return. It was as though she belonged to them like some prize, and the sight of her rowing away to sea drove them mad with frothing fury. Fiona's eyes welled with tears of abject fear, for above the crowd of these hybrid monsters flew forth a masked, slender man, hooded and draped in deep red robes. He floated toward Fiona, slowly but surely. He bore a mask depicting the same face of mad agony as the egg-shaped statue. Fiona rowed faster, and by God's grace the tide of the sea was on her side. But still the sorcerer levitated ever more across the sea, and began to speak with a voice that cut through the torrent of rain and rumbling thunder. It was a language Fiona did not understand, but one that caused her bones to chill with a shiver as though she were about to get a flu. Fright consumed her at the mad spectacle, and she stopped rowing. Drenched in rain, it hid her sobbing at the hopelessness of this nightmare. How could she escape such strange arcane power? She clutched her amulet as the boat rocked through the waves while lightning snapped about and thunder roared. With trembling lips she wailed quick prayers to God, broken every now and then by sobs of dread. The sorcerer floated ever calmly toward her, speaking in that terrible speech that split the air like a knife. Fiona curled up, knees high, and rocked herself in fear as the voice grew ever more present within her. She buried her head by her knees and wept. The words, the spells of the sorcerer were slowly seeping into invasive thoughts in her mind. Oh, dark thoughts. The hymns and chants of Greenwichian piety eroded feverishly from her mind to be replaced by an initial darkness that gave way to violent, debauched ideas. Primal figments so brutal and bloody that she stopped rocking with fear and instead growled an angry screech of maddening rage. The voice echoed more and more ideas that made her blood grow hot with the pleasure of sadistic cruelty. Of choking the Dwerga by the coast, watching the life fade from their eyes, snapping Anne's neck when she was upon her thigh, violently ravish and molest the elf who caught her by the door, gutting Fingal the way she gutted the boar, again and again and again, watching him squirm under her lacerations. Rage consumed her mind so much that at last she lifted her head from her knees and screamed with fury, grabbed the oars. Yes, go back. She wanted to go back. Back to Armorica. Free from inhibition. Back to madness. A sudden flash of static light made her blink from the mindless carnage her soul felt, and as though waking from a dream, she looked up, startled, at the sorcerer, who was no longer speaking his enchantments. A bolt of lightning had just struck the sorcerer, making him shudder violently. He looked up to the clouds above and let out an inhuman scream that pierced through the chorus of the storm. He was replied with a savage boom of thunder that doused all other sound. The sorcerer stopped, somewhat stupefied, remaining on its point of levitation above the sea as Fiona stared on, breathing heavily and wiping hair from her face. What the hell's just happened? She thought incredulously. He slowly pointed a pale, gnarly finger at her. He did not say anything, nor did he move. He simply stayed levitating and pointing at her as both oars and tide washed her further and further away from the village of Saltmarsh, until the fog of the sea veiled the arcane apparition out from existence. She rowed ever backward, trying to understand what just happened. In a terrible moment, she had felt herself being lost to... Lost to what? Evil came the first word in her mind. She blinked as the fog was all she could see now, lost in a limbo of a violent sea that swept her in an easterly direction. Unable to fathom what monstrous nightmare she had just survived, from beginning the journey to the terrible dreams and compelling dark acts to finding Fingal, she broke into a whimpering sob and whispered thanks to the heavens, God and the 12, and Fingal. It took her some time before her face was no longer creased in anguish, and was instead a numb, absent candor. The seas were pulling her further and further away from the cursed land. After letting all the pain out with her tears, she slowly, gently shut her eyes, calming herself and slowly gripped the oars. Fiona rowed homeward, as far as she could from Armorica and its dreams.